Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane, and I am the director of the Ashland Public Library in Massachusetts, as I said, and I'm very excited to be here with Caitlin Cass, who's going to be talking about her book, Suffrage Song, which is the haunted history of gender, race, and voting rights in the US, which is just timely and topical and fascinating, but it's also a graphic novel. So we'll be talking about that a little bit more in a second, but I have a couple of things to say. One is I'd like to thank the Friends of the Ashland Public Library for supporting all of our programming. And I'd like to thank Caitlin for letting us share this program with other local libraries, 30 of which signed on to join us for this very special program. So for anybody who knows me, you know that I think that when libraries work together, we make magic. So that's what's happening tonight. You can buy signed books from Caitlin, Suffrage Song, from Aesop's Fable. I'll put a link in the chat, but the book is actually not coming out until next Tuesday. So if you can wait, get it from there. If not, well, you'll have to because it won't be out in the world until then anyways, anywhere. So, but you can certainly look for it at your local library after it's out, including Ashland, because we did order it. So Caitlin, like I said, has written this book, Suffrage Song, and I love it because I love comics and I feel like they make books and information incredibly accessible for people. So I feel like this is a perfect way for us to learn about a very difficult topic historically, but also currently. And so her images are just really, really amazing. So welcome, Caitlin. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for
Well,
inviting me.
yeah, we've been totally looking forward to it. Before you start your slides, I want to let you can bring them up, but I want to let people know you can put your questions in the Q&A, which is a button at the bottom of your screen, your Zoom screen. And I'm going to turn the chat off during Caitlin's slides so that we're not distracted, but I'll turn it back on when the slides are over and we're getting into our Q&A. So let's go, Caitlin. Tell us about yourself and about Suffrage Song.
Great. Thank you so much. So this image that's on the cover slide here is actually not in the book, but it's from a long panorama that I created that was on view at the Omaha, at an exhibition in Omaha. And then it's going to travel to Oak Park, Illinois, where I'm from. The book, here's the final cover. It covers the history of women and the fight to vote, and also racism within the fight to vote for women. And it sort of focuses on the years 1848 to 1965. 1920 is when the 19th Amendment passed, which gave women the right to vote, but did not include provisions to make sure that all women could vote. And so a lot of minority women across the country still face restrictions that made it so they couldn't vote. And the book is color coded, so different sections, and you'll see this throughout the images that I'm going to share with you, are different eras are different colors. So the yellow is the color of the earliest suffragists in the US, so mid-1800s. And these were women who started the fight to vote in 1848, but were not able to ever vote themselves. Green is for women who were contemporaries of those first earliest suffragists, but were able to vote before they died. And then blue is for the women that were working around the turn of the century in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And then red is for the civil rights movement. And so this, I'm not like super strict about that. Like there's always remnants of these colors, but sometimes other ones get involved, and I sort of play with the color schemes and even use purple a little bit for this era between 1920 and 1965 when there's content that overlaps. But I think it's helpful to just know that as we're going forward. I'm starting with a little bit of an excerpt from the very beginning of the book, the introduction. And so I'll do a reading, and it's split up. So it goes panel by panel, because I find it super distracting when you show a whole page of the comic because you want to start reading ahead. So I'll read this to you. This history was written for ghosts. These ghosts exist at the fault lines. They emerge from the fissures. They occupy the space between what is and what is not said. They embody the anxiety of existing in a broken system. They represent the history that still needs to be reckoned with and the history that remains unwritten. At times, they evoke a paralyzing fear. At others, they offer the only possible way forward. The United States was built on broken treaties with indigenous nations. White Americans grew their wealth by enslaving Black people. White women played an active role in oppressing others, even as they fought their own oppression. This history haunts me in ways I'm still trying to understand. Anthropologist Ann Stoller writes about how imperialism subtly infiltrates private, everyday spaces. Relations of empire crash through and recede from easy purview, sunder families, storm sequestered spaces, and indelibly permeate or sometimes graze with only a scarred trace institutions and the landscapes of people's lives. And that's by her book, Haunted by Empire. The racism that fueled America's growth continues to impact my everyday life. When I started this project, I was working through dread. This is winter 2019. I had a deep and growing anxiety about white women in history. I knew that many white women's rights activists were racist, and yet I was uncomfortable with this label. Sure, but it's more complicated than that. Now I'd say, yes, and it's complicated. I resisted calling these women racist for fear that it would negate all the good they did. I felt shame my ancestors had voting privileges while many people did not. This made me revert to absolutes, as if a person can't be both good and bad at the same time. I struggled to hold all the good white suffragists did in my head alongside all the damage they caused. It was easier to focus on the bad, but that wasn't the whole story. Here's Carrie Chapman Catt, who is a particularly upsetting offender, saying, "I'll say whatever racist thing it takes to get white women the vote." These women fought for my right to vote, and so I felt linked to them by both gratitude and shame. And here I am voting in the 2020 election. There's Carrie Chapman Catt behind me. These women haunted me. In her book, Caste, Isabel Wilkerson talks about how the US never truly dealt with slavery's legacy. Whatever is lurking will fester, whether you choose to look or not. Germany was forced to reckon with the Holocaust. They pay reparations to survivors and incorporated the history into their school curriculums. In the US, teaching the history of racism remains controversial. STEM, not CRT. Stop teaching critical race theory to kids. Education, not indoctrination. The wound has festered and old themes endure. The more research I did for this project, the more I saw how interconnected the struggles of all disenfranchised groups were. Francis Watkins Harper put it best in 1866. We are all bound up together in one great bundle of humanity, and society cannot trample on the weakest of its members without receiving a curse in its own soul. As I assembled this history, it often felt violent or wrong to pull a single narrative line from the mess. Here's my bulletin board, and you could see Susan B. Anthony, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Alice Paul there. And I just wrote fragments on a piece of paper. I resolved to leave it fragmented. I wanted to present the pieces for the reader to connect instead of telling them how to connect them. I wanted to recreate the experience of looking through archives. I did not want to insert myself into the narrative. It's not about me. It's about how history rhymes, okay? Of course, I was already there in the wavering line drawings and in every tiny choice. What is wrong with me? Did I really think I could remove myself, write some kind of objective history? What is this, 1895? This introduction is here to remind you that I am here. You're stuck with me. I'm a regular old human being trying to untie some knots I felt to see if I can understand them better. I spent many years making comics about failure and how people, mostly dead white men, kept trying to spite it. These are boxes of the different volumes of mini comics that I've made. They were buffoons, but they still tried, so there was hope until a real buffoon got elected. Suddenly, the flailing white guys didn't seem so funny, so I looked elsewhere. And so here's a bunch of books by all of the women who are covered in the story. And then also you could see the very beginnings of some of the titles of the history books, the actual titles that I was reading. There's still failure in these pages, but there's also impossibly slow incremental change. These women did so much work. This change was not inevitable. Across centuries, these women channeled history into action. So that was the introduction of the book. I didn't want to put myself in it at first, like I mentioned, but I just felt at the end that it was just really necessary to have some kind of bias statement at the beginning. I think that's really important in any history, to kind of discuss where you're coming from and what your agenda is, because I think that that's always there no matter what, even if you try really hard to make your story as objective as possible. I, of course, am somebody who believes strongly in historical fact, but I also realize that bias is there, and we need to acknowledge it. So this is what the final book looks like. It's also right behind me. One of the things that I think is super fun about the book is that they agreed to do all these fold outs. So as you're reading through it, there's, I think, 4 different fold outs that actually open up. In different ways. There's gatefolds, and there's that one that does the 4, like I just showed you. But I think it really helps kind of create more of that experience of wonder of looking through an archive as you're studying. And it also forces somebody to sort of slow down and think about the physical act of dealing with this history, which I think is important. And it makes you think about the book as an object too. As I was creating this, it actually was created in installments with these mini comics. So I would mail them out to subscribers. I've been doing this for 13 years, and I send them every other month. So it kind of was created in that archive way. Like I was producing these smaller booklets to come up with this larger book. And I've always been a huge fan of self-publishing. And I also just love the fact that this is part of the history of women's suffrage as well. So you can see this is Susan B. Anthony handing out pamphlets at one of her talks that would have been in a church. She went around the country and usually found churches to speak in where they would let her. And sometimes she was turned away, but often they would let her come, and then she would sell her women's suffrage pamphlets to spread the word. And she self-published these pamphlets. And I just like that history of self-publishing has that connection with my own work as well. And then I created this book by hand, and it had the fold outs. And this is how I got them to agree to put in all the fold outs, because I made this handmade book with the printouts from my computer, and then I glue bound it and hand drew and painted the cover. And there's also a slip cover, which you see in the back. And so I sent this, and you can see it has the original title. I wanted to call it Suffrage Ghosts, U.S. Women and the Fight to Vote. Maybe in the Q&A, I can explain why the title shifted. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about the new title. But this is the mock-up that I created of the book. And then this is the final cover. You can see the degree to which I was really inspired by the visual culture of these different time periods. So this is a suffrage songbook from the early 1900s, 1916. And you could see the degree to which I directly sort of riffed on this cover. The title Suffrage Song, and suffrage songs in general, I really liked it as a title, and I talk about this more in the book, because the suffrage songs were used to create communal feeling at suffrage rallies, to make people feel like they were part of the group, for sure. But as they fought stereotypes of women, they also kind of enforced some of them, often kind of enforcing these ideas of women in their sphere at home. And maybe they're allowed to express their opinions or maybe vote, but like ultimately they're going to stay in their sphere. And the songs kind of enforce that. And so I talk a little bit about the ways in which the songs were helpful at the same time as they were destructive in small ways. And I feel like on some level, that's what it's like to create a history of a movement. There's always going to be something that I leave out. And so Suffrage Song seemed like a good title for that reason. Talking a little bit about stereotypes in the media at the time, Godey's Lady Book was a popular women's magazine that had these beautiful fashion illustrations that are actually hand colored by women. And they were, it was a great magazine in that it was one of the first venues for women to write. So a lot of fiction writers got a chance to publish their stories in this. Book reviews were published in addition to sewing tutorials and recipes and fashion. But generally speaking, this publication kind of reinforced women in their, keeping them in their sphere, not talking about politics. They weren't supposed to talk about politics at all in the magazine. And in fact, the only way they were able to express their opinion, so Sarah Hale, who was the main editor, she had Southern sympathies, and she wanted to underline that this magazine didn't support abolition. And so she would publish more book reviews of anti-abolition books than pro-abolition books. So I think there's like subtle unsaid content in all of these illustrations. So I created these etchings. These are within the story. In this example, 50,000 men died at Gettysburg. Maybe we should end slavery. Our dresses keep getting more amazing. Radicalism is unbecoming of a lady. So the stereotypes that were perpetuated by this magazine become explicit in these illustrations that I've incorporated. A lot of the book is about how history gets written, and the ways in which the media of the time period affects what's remembered, and also the ways in which the authors of the history and their biases affect that history. So the history of women's suffrage was actually eventually a 4-volume book, and the first 3 volumes were written by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, who are depicted here on the left, Susan B. Anthony, on the right, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And they wrote it with Matilda Jocelyn Gage, who was very critical of the fact that the books, it seems to me, she says, that these books are primarily about the two of you. They did make effort to include people from across the country. They solicited materials. They got a bunch of stuff sent to them, and they incorporated stories of the movement from all over the country. But of course, theirs were the center of it. And they felt like it was super important that there be a suffrage origin story for future generations to continue this multi-generational fight. And they created it. And so, but of course, it's got a bias, like I've been talking about. The book really focuses a lot on this pivotal moment after the Civil War, where Black people and white people were banding together to fight for universal suffrage for everyone. So the thought was that the Black people and white women could get the vote at the same time. It didn't have to be it's separate, like we could all fight for universal suffrage. But that was kind of abandoned in favor of making sure that the Black male vote was prioritized, sort of in the fallout of the Civil War. It became clear that it was super important to make sure that that would happen. And so it was decided mostly by the white male leaders of the group that this was the right choice to be made. And of course, Frederick Douglass was also in favor of this, and most Black women in the movement were as well, because of course they saw how important it was, because people were dying. And of course there weren't white women dying because they couldn't vote. They might face abuse, and it was terrible, but there was a lot of arguments to be made that the Black male vote should be prioritized. And so because of this, there was a split in the two suffrage organizations, the NWSA, led by Stanton and Anthony. They believed now, instead of universal suffrage, an educated suffrage. They thought that people who had an education should be prioritized for voting over people who did not have a formal education. And the AWSA, the American Women's Suffrage Association, which was led by Lucy Stone and Henry Blackwell, decided they were going to prioritize the Black male vote. So the book deals with this and sort of trying to unpack what it meant. and also trying to examine how it echoed through this choice into the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Another theme in the book is talking about suffrage and spiritualism. So spiritualism was a religious movement to channel the dead. A lot of historians will talk about how it happened in the wake of the Civil War because so many people had died and people were trying to contact and connect with their loved ones after this very traumatic event. And so this religious fad spread quickly. It became a place where a lot of early women's rights activists first found their public voice. It was very taboo at the time for women to speak in public, but if they were channeling dead people, it was considered okay. And actually, Elizabeth Cady Stanton wrote her Declaration of Sentiments on a seance table. And I just found this history really fascinating, and the fact that Elizabeth Cady Stanton felt like she was channeling the spirit of the American Revolution as she was writing her declaration was inspiring to me. And I figured if ghosts helped Elizabeth Cady Stanton write that Declaration of Sentiments, maybe they could help me sort of deal with unpacking the racism within this history. I incorporated the ghosts, and I was thinking a lot about how they were edited out and often not included in suffrage histories because the spiritualism aspect, because of the fact that the message needed to be kept clear. And in fact, there's actually this entire book I found. This is called Lucy Boston, that is a satire about women's rights and suffrage and spiritualism. So basically mocking the early women suffragists for believing in spiritualism and sort of conflating these two things together. And so as a result of that, there was like extra effort made to make sure that the spiritualists were not associated with the women's suffrage movement. And I found that really fascinating. The book also, of course, deals with why certain histories are remembered and others aren't. Mary Church Terrell, founding member of the National Association of Colored Women and daughter of 2 former slaves, risked arrest to picket for suffrage at the White House gates. She brought her daughter along and likely inspired other Black women to picket, but their names are lost to history. So Alice Paul recounted that she had been there protesting at the White House gates, but it is not documented in the organization's records. And I think that that is really an interesting thing. And it left me to muse a bit on what it means for something to be lost to history. So I'm going to close with this little reading of another section that's musing on that topic. But what does it mean to be lost to history? There she is, Mary Church Terrell, picketing with her daughter, the White House gates. Law suggests passivity, but history is active. In 1921, Mary Church Terrell asked the NWP to pressure Congress to investigate the disenfranchisement of Black women across the South. No woman in this country needs the ballot more than the colored women of the South. History is made, written, edited. There is more than one to write. Terrell's words were not recorded in the stenographer's report, and they were left out of the published meeting minutes. They are victims of lynching, the conflict lease system, the Jim Crow lines. Just as every choice erases possibility, each history written leaves behind casualties. The National Women's Party refused to help. Is it possible to write history that leaves room for their ghosts? Miss Paul did not want to inject the race problem into her suffrage work, says NWP member Ella Murray. Ghosts to show us what could have been, could be, if our systems made it be. Alice Paul asked me, what do you women want me to do? There was Mary Church Terrell. Ghosts to suggest new systems, new ways of being. I said, I want you to tell us whether you endorse the enforcement of the 19th Amendment for all women. History that breathes, that lives, that creates possibility. Paul refused to help. She feared losing the ground many women had gained with the 19th Amendment. Universal suffrage didn't work for Aunt Susan. Why would it work for us? History that refuses to accept a broken system as the only system. Alice Paul had a chance to reject racism. What if she had taken it? I try really hard in this book not to come down with value judgments, but I want the reader to kind of be able to take their own. And I think sometimes leaving it with the question of what would have happened if she had done the right thing here is really important. The book ends in the civil rights movement, and it talks about Fannie Lou Hamer testifying at the Democratic National Convention about how many Black women throughout the South were not allowed to vote. And in fact, when she tried to register to vote, the bullets were shot through her window. And later, after she had registered to vote and was returning from a citizenship workshop, she faced some severe police brutality after she was arrested for helping to integrate a lunch counter at a rest stop with the people she was with. So it kind of just examines the ways that the choices that were made in the past echo into the future. The book is available in stores on June 18th. And now I think we can take some questions.
Yes, I am back. Wow. I love your illustrations. They're so, we'll talk more. Okay, so as I said to everybody, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. I will be moderating them, but I'm going to start with the one that you kind of left on the table of why the title changed. And I noticed that you kept the ghosts in there a lot. So obviously you had the last word or the last picture, but what happened there?
Oh, well, so that it's kind of silly, really. I mean, I almost wish I maybe should stop mentioning it. But so because I really like the title we landed on. I think in some ways it's stronger and less just descriptive of the book.
Mhm.
But the suffrage ghosts, it was because there's a lot of graphic novels that have ghosts in the title.
Mhm.
And they were worried that it would be read as a children's or YA book more quickly if it had that title.
Mhm.
Which, as a librarian, maybe you could tell me if you think that's a good suggestion.
I think whatever gets them to read is a good title.
Yeah, cool.
Anybody really. So this book from the beginning, was it geared towards any particular age group?
No, I mean, I really making it for myself, and hoping it would be interesting to people. So, no, I think there's police brutality in it, and it mentions rape. So like I was talking to somebody who had a master's in children's literature, and they said, 12 is usually the safe age, if people are wondering. But I think there's some spots that are like pretty complex that might go over a young person's head. So probably more high school and adult.
Yeah. I think that's interesting because again, there's this perception that comic books or cartoons are for children. And so to put in any kind of really in-depth information into it, like it changes it, and we have to think about that. People our attendees really enjoyed your presentation. Dale says it was excellent. And so does our anonymous person here. And then we got the target age range for the talk. So now looking back at your bio, you have a book out called Humans in Peril, a Book of Gags. So how did you go from that to Suffrage Song?
Oh, sure. Okay, so the Book of Gags is those are rejected New Yorker cartoons. So I've submitted over 700 cartoons and I've sold about 13. So that's just sort of par for the course and actually a pretty good rate. But the themes of a lot of them, just sort of by happenstance, because it's what's on my mind, is climate change and various other crises, the refugee crisis, all these things that are sort of because of climate change. So I named that particular collection of 50 gag comics, Humans in Peril. But it's certainly an ongoing theme in my work, is just like kind of confronting these giant problems. And so, of course, thinking about voting rights was along those lines for me, even though very broadly, my work is kind of just about whatever is fascinating me at a time, especially if it happens to relate with disasters, because I don't know. I did historical reenactment when I was a kid in the cemetery, and just like yearly, not like all the time. And we were always playing disaster victims. So it might have come from there. When I was 7, I made some adults cry with a story about the Iroquois Theater fire. I was a Iroquois Theater fire victim. It was the reason the exit signs exit doors need to open out instead of in, because they all got stuck inside this theater in Chicago. So anyway, maybe it has to do with that, but I like to study disaster.
And I'm going to go back to your bio again, because the very first line of it says, Caitlin Cass makes comics, cartoons, and art installations about failing systems and irrational hope. Story by story, she's building her own canon in a doomed effort to understand the dismal state of the world. Now, I have to say, are you feeling any better or worse with the work that you've been doing around the world, around what happens in the world now, given what you've been learning and sharing?
Do I feel better or worse? I feel the same. I just feel like we're making the same mistakes over and over, is what I would say. And I guess I find hope just in studying the people who were trying to make it better. I guess there's definitely evidence of that incremental change. And I feel hope in the ways that people have successfully worked together. I talk a little bit about this in the epilogue of the book, but I do feel like there's a way forward, right? Like I'm not just throwing my hands up in a sort of existential dread. I think that that's a bit of a myth that makes it easy to not act. And I do want to encourage people to act. I don't think it's hopeless, right? So like you have to believe in that irrational hope, even if it seems totally ridiculous.
Mm-hmm. And I wonder if the women back in that time actually felt the same way you do, like this is hopeless, but we have to do something. If we know we don't do it, nobody's gonna do it, and we'll just always be in the same place, right? Couple of questions in the Q&A. Francis asks, how many drawings are in the book, and about how long does it take you to draw each one?
Oh boy. Okay, so I think it's like 200. It's like 230 pages, but maybe 210 of full pages. But around each page takes around 8 hours to actually draw in color and ink, I think. But then so when I was making it, I was usually doing it in like 4-page blocks, and it would be like 2 weeks of research and then like a week of drawing those 4 pages. And so it took 5 years to make it, but the last 2 years were mostly editing. So it was like super concentrated work before that.
But you had been sending out those
mini comics,
yeah, mini comics for around the same time, or was it like years before that?
Oh, for years before. I've been doing that for 13 years.
That's right.
And the book is 5 years of work.
So were you just compiling what you had been sending out and then putting it together to make the story you wanted to tell?
I was kind of simultaneously doing both. So like I would always have to format it for the book, format it for the gallery space, and format it for a mini comic at the same time. But I find that part really fun. I think that those restrictions sometimes really help you come up with ideas and the way to tell them. Like oftentimes I draw the panels on the page before I know what the story is. And I find that especially like a 9-panel grid or a grid that's based on 9 panels is really conducive to the pacing. And sometimes I can just change that panel structure in order to sort of change the pacing of the story. And so when it's an important moment, I can just change that structure, which I just really love. So thinking about that formal quality of the book so consciously in order to share it across formats really is fun for me.
That's amazing, because there's somebody asked me the other day, why do kids like comics? What's the importance of them? And I had my own answer, but I'd like to hear from you, like why do we like comics?
Sure. Well, I mean, for one thing, we're just like more and more saturated with images every day. And I feel like, for a long time, we had to just sort of look at the written word. And now that we have images back, it's reminding us that we have this whole other way to think about ideas. And I think sometimes an image and the text can mean, can conflict. So I think that comics are really great for telling complex histories because you can present two ideas simultaneously, and you can do that in prose, but it's just maybe like a little bit less direct. It can't be there on the page, this image that's one thing and the text that's this other thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know, I found it really conducive to telling histories.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I had said something like that really, the comics and the prose together hits all parts of our brain.
Mm-hmm.
So if you are more prone to liking text, then it hits that part of your brain and it's perfect. And if you're more likely to be able to relate with images, then it hits your part of the brain and then they come together and you're like, whoa, mind blown.
Totally. Yeah.
So Yvette asks, did you go to art school to learn your ability?
Well, so I went first for great books. So I studied great books at St. John's College. And so it was like history, math, and science, comp lit, and philosophy, but very like Western canon. And so part of my project became kind of learning about the things that weren't necessarily part of that education. But then I went to graduate school for visual studies. So I have like a super broad humanities education. And it wasn't specifically about comics, but I was making comics.
Mm-hmm.
It was a studio art program, but it was, mostly me learning about comics. There are schools now where you can study comics. Those programs are becoming more popular, and I've helped develop one at UNO. But I think that it's still pretty new. Schools are figuring out how to integrate it and where to put it, if it's going to be in English or if it's going to be in art. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes you have to create partnerships to make that happen, or so it's exciting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think schools, teachers, educators are really coming around to that reading comics and graphic novels is reading. It's just maybe uses a different part of your brain, as I said. Stephanie asks, and I think you sort of answered this before, but I'm going to ask a follow-up question. How did you go from creating the short comics to a longer book? And my follow-up is, did you know when you started sending out those short comics that you were going to put them into a book?
Well, when I first started sending them out, it was when I was in grad school, and it was just a way to start sharing my work and having to be accountable, to make sure I kept making things. And it definitely did that. So I always kind of hoped it would become something bigger than the small comics, but I was also thinking about it just more practically. And the suffrage project came along actually in part because, well, I was working at an all-girls high school. And so there was a natural shift in my work because of that, like just trying to explore more of these histories of women and people of color and the LGBTQ community. And so there was that natural turn in my work, and a curator in Buffalo saw that, and there were grant opportunities from the New York State Council on the Arts, and the National Endowment for the Arts for the 19th Amendment celebration. Which I think is really important to mention, because a lot of the history of the suffrage movement, was controlled by when and where they could get money. And because the country and the states in this decided they wanted to support and uphold this history and share it, that's the reason I got to make this book.
Mm-hmm.
So I created this exhibition, and it was also a comic that was online for that gallery. And then I just didn't want to stop. So it kept growing, and I doubled the length of the story, and then it ended up getting published by Fantagraphics.
Mm-hmm. I love that your introduction, I think I said this before, is in comic format, because most people do that just as prose, even if it's a graphic novel. So I appreciated that, because you just start off with a bang, like, this is how it is. And putting yourself out there like that, I thought was really, really amazing. Talking about your own biases in a way that people can understand, because they see it both, again, in picture and prose. Francis says, we tend to tell the story of both women's rights and civil rights in a triumphant, positive, inevitable way, when in reality, they were really stories of incredibly long and painful failures. Why do you think the history isn't told honestly? And what's the cost of sanitizing this history?
Oh, wow. There's such a cost, right? Like, it makes us forget. And maybe, there's still ongoing threats to voting rights with gerrymandering and voter ID laws, and just like trying to stew doubt in our system, right?
Mhm.
So I think by sanitizing the history and making it appear that this was inevitable, or that it was the people in power's choice to give the vote to women. I think that definitely is a problem, because it makes it appear that these fights weren't like long and hard.
Mm-hmm.
Sure.
Well, that goes back to something that you were saying earlier with the panel with the two women and the third woman, say, I can't remember names, I'm so sorry, saying, this seems like it's about you and not about the movement. And who told those stories, and what has been lost to history because our stories haven't been told. I think for me, like right now is a really great time, because more and more stories of all kinds of people are coming out, so much more than they were before. And
Totally.
yeah. But I always find it's really interesting how did you do your research? Because a lot of the stories are lost. Like you said about Mary Terrell, there was nothing there.
Right. Okay. Well, so that's such a good question, especially because it gives me the opportunity to just say, like, from when I started this project to when I finished it, like, so many books came out that helped me specifically with this project, because historians were getting those same grants I got, to create this story. And I couldn't have made it as I finished it the way when I started, like, so that was so fascinating to me, to be able to be there and watch the history get written. And so there's a lot of things that go into it. I mean, one is just there, and if you go back to when women started writing history, so there's talk about like how certain things weren't considered worthy of historical research. So things like labor and women's work. You couldn't write a history about that because the types of sources that were available to write those histories weren't considered academic enough. And so I think a lot of it has to do with what is allowed as a source, like the degree to which firsthand accounts are allowed, the degree to which newspaper accounts are allowed, with also reading other things, because old newspapers were unreliable sometimes. And it also just has to do with what money is available for that research, right? And if people can get the support, if it's that kind of research is allowed at the institutional level. And so suddenly it is, because the cultural moment has changed, and because of the efforts of protesters and activists. And it's been really cool. So the actual mechanics of how I did the research is a lot of it relied on historians, because I myself am not a historian. So I just read extremely widely, from popular history to more academic histories and then I even started getting into like anthropology and biopolitics at the end. And just like getting into it and excited. And then I did a little bit of original research when it came to local history, when I couldn't find stuff out about Buffalo, or also like the spiritualism. I looked at some archives from the University of Rochester and found that a letter where Susan B. Anthony talks about the spirits of the revolution. So there was like a little bit of original research, but like anything that's like a lot of what I cover in the book is because those are the kinds of histories I could find. And so there's a very detailed bibliography. If anyone's interested in reading more, you can find all the books I read in the back.
Oh my gosh. Okay, so I just want to remind everybody that you can buy the book signed by Caitlin from Aesop's Fable, and I did put the link in the chat. I'll do it again in a bit, but I wanted to ask about just the breadth of what you wrote about, because there's so many ways you could have gone with this book. I mean, you talked about the spiritualism, and you talked about the divergence from, in terms of race, and, the Black men, Black women, white black, white men. At what point did you make a decision to really focus on the white suffrage, or did you?
So I guess it came out of probably just like the George Floyd protests, that was when I was making this. And I knew I needed to talk about civil rights, and I knew that before those protests, but like I didn't realize it was going to become the thrust of the entire book. Like I just thought I would continue the story into the civil rights movement, rather than it also being like looking critically at the history and finding those moments where white women made these racist choices. So it definitely came out of the current historical moment, I think that bias is evident in the introduction for sure. So yeah, that's why.
And as a white person writing about this situation, did you feel any pressure to not write about the Black perspective?
Oh yeah, man, it was so scary. And I'm sure there's imperfect ways I've done it, and I hope people tell me so I can learn from them. But it's terrifying to just draw a person of a different race than you because of the history of caricature and cartoon, and the way that comics and early newspaper comics help perpetuate these racist stereotypes. And so I was just like always making sure, like combating that fear and knowing that it would be worse to not include these people, right? And I'm not like intentionally drawing a caricature of anyone, and hopefully if I keep that in mind, that won't look that way, right? But yeah, it was definitely scary, and that was sort of the project for me. It was leaning into things that made me uncomfortable and trying to unpack why.
Well, I think from just, like our quick view of your cartoons from this presentation, your style sort of really stays the same. So it's not like you drew differently for somebody of a different race. You know what I mean? Like, I think that you were respectful across the board of using your own style of creating your characters.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think that's like, it's just to use the same, right, and not to add more detail. That's the big thing I was thinking about.
Okay. So Lisa says your work is so creative and beautiful. Thank you for making women's history come alive through your art and narrative. And Kathleen says, I find this presentation so informative and entertaining. I love this. Looking forward to reading the book. I want to share with all of the women and girls and men in my family. And Yvette says that it seems like you learned a lot about yourself through this process. Did you feel like that?
That's totally true. I mean, hopefully it isn't just for me, obviously, but I don't want to make the whole history of suffrage about me, but I think that seeing it through my eyes is maybe helpful, right? Like, I don't think it's a problem that I'm in it.
No, but you're also doing something sort of unique and bringing these stories in a way, again, through art that is more accessible to so many of us. It's not as scary as just reading words.
Sure. Yep.
Process them. So I want to go back a little bit to that story you said about when you were 7 years old and scaring your family with the Iroquois history. Have you always known you were going to be an artist?
I always knew I wanted to be a storyteller. So that took on many iterations, from wanting to be a children's book illustrator to wanting to be an actor during that time period to back to wanting to be a prose writer when I was in high school. And then when I went to study the great books and suddenly had no art classes is when I started reading graphic novels. I was working in a library, actually. I was doing the interlibrary loan over the summer at my college library. And I just started interlibrary loaning all these graphic novels. And I was like, oh my gosh, there's these comics for adults. Like, I wanted to be a kid's book illustrator when I was young. This is what I need to do. I want to tell stories to adults with pictures. So, I kind of knew I wanted to tell stories, but wasn't sure what that would look like.
Mm-hmm. So you've actually sort of been part of this movement in the last maybe decade of really bringing cartoons to adults. They were starting to come out, but then you joined that wave, I guess, because it's relatively new.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, well, so like I was part of the generation that read Art Spiegelman in school. So Mouse was out when I was in school. But that was the only comic that I read until I was in college, I think. Well, I mean, I also read like comic strips growing up, but comics for adults. And then McSweeney's, which was a lit mag, had a comics issue 13. And I think I was maybe a senior in high school when I found that. And so that was sort of planted the seeds for me. So I think I'm more like a second generation of people who are, and I mean, going back to the 60s, there's like R. Crumb and people. But I feel like Mouse, of course, is a really important one that was actually like the serious history. So I feel like the second generation of it, I would say.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, we could talk about graphic novels forever because I'm so fascinated by the whole thing. But Stephanie has a really good question about what you did. Could you talk more about the submission process and how you decided to submit to Fantagraphics?
Sure. So I go to a lot of comics festivals around the country. The one I probably go to the most because I used to live in Buffalo, New York, is the Toronto Comic Arts Festival. It's amazing. It's huge. Comics are like super accepted in Canada as a medium to tell serious stories. And so I always had a great time at this event. And one time there was a panel that I went to that was just different publishers talking about how they worked with their artists. And a lot of them will accept a script and sort of work on it with the artist and sort of edit it as they go. But I knew I really wanted to try to make my story myself, like start to finish. And Fantagraphics said that what they did was they accepted completed books. And so I submitted my completed book to them. And I just figured that would allow me to work without the pressure to sort of like frame the story and figure it out as I went. Because I was worried about the anxiety it would be to actually work side by side with an editor on the story.
Well, and then it's not always your story.
Right. Well, but I mean, I'm fine with. I'm kind of like, well, it could have been useful as far as like fact checking and like structure and stuff. But yeah, it was important to me to just be able to discover that on my own for the first time. And then now maybe I'm better at taking the feedback and incorporating it with my own ideas, but I just wasn't really sure what I was doing yet. So I wanted the opportunity to try to figure it out myself.
Can I ask like a very comic-y question? Is that, did you create your own font or did you handwrite the font?
So I hand wrote it. And in fact, I made a font and it just looked mechanical and different throughout the whole. So I ended up having to re-letter a bunch of it because the font just didn't look right to me. Yeah.
Do you ever see that TV show? I'm totally aging myself. Caroline in the City. And
I feel like I did see that as a young person. Yes.
So it
might have been an influence.
I love that show because it showed the process of her making comics. Like she would do the lettering and she had somebody doing the coloring. It was just so cool. I'm definitely a lot older than some people maybe in the audience. So Frances has a question that I also have is, what other big topics are you interested in taking on in the future?
Great. Yeah. So before I started this project, I was working on stories of the history of industry in the US. and sort of the history and sort of the rational exuberance of material extraction and oil and these things. And I'm returning to that, but I'm focusing specifically on Ida Tarbell right now, who was the muckraker that took down Standard Oil. And actually, she was an anti-suffragist, so it's kind of interesting. So that's where I'm exploring next.
Can you make maybe a recommendation or two for other books that we should read that, or graphic novels that we should read that have a good, like yours, like that we would really learn from?
Sure. I really love Nora Krug's Belonging, which is about her experience reckoning as a German with the history of the Holocaust. So I feel like there's some affinities with my book. That's probably my favorite graphic history right now. Trying to think if there's any other ones. I'm looking at my shelf. That's the main one, but I got to think about that one and come up with some other ones for future
Did
things
you
like
say
this.
that was Nora Krieg?
It's Krug. I think it's Krug,
Okay, all right.
but I'm
Yeah.
not sure. It could be Krug. I don't know how to pronounce it.
Okay, and of course, Mouse, which
Mouse. Yeah, definitely Mouse.
there's
Oh,
so
there's
many.
a great I think is it Joe Sacco, a book about the oil industry in Canada, and about history of Native involvement in the oil industry as well. It's so an indigenous community.
It's
I
called
forget what it's called.
Paying the Land by
Oh,
Seth.
Paying the Land. Okay, you knew.
No, Stephanie knew.
Oh, cool.
In this Q&A. Yeah, we have a very smart crew here. And Ginny says 10 Days in a Madhouse based on Nellie Bly.
Oh,
That's a
I
good
haven't read
one.
that. I should read that one.
That is a very good one. I totally agree. There's so many. I mean, like aside from just like the Roz Chast book about mental health and illness and things like that, so good. So again, there's like this really amazing time right now for us to read graphic novels and learn something and feel something and not just like it's not just MCU and DC, right?
Totally.
Although I bet you would do a great job with that too.
I don't know. I don't think they like my drawings very much.
I thought your drawings were, great.
Thank
So,
you. They're quirky.
yeah, well, I think that there's a place for everything, right?
Right. I want it to look handmade. That's like my goal. I don't want it to look super slick because I want it to feel like a person made it,
So did you use any, we're just about a time I have to ask if you used any online tools for your drawing, or do you draw them, do you do everything hand drawn?
This I hand drew pretty much every page and then I colored it digitally. But it's more, I mean, to me, drawing on the screen at this point is kind of the same. So part of me feels like bad as far as like the just climate change and using materials, but it keeps it so that I'm not like editing every single little thing. It makes it so that there's like space between the editing process and the drawing process, so it helps speed it up a little bit.
So are you saying that if you were to do it on paper, you would, every time you made a mistake, you'd have to start that entire panel over again?
No, I'm actually saying that if I did it on the computer, if I drew the original on the computer, then I would be editing it, like over editing it as I went. Like I want the human hand to be there. So it's helpful to me to have to do it on paper first.
Oh, that totally makes sense. I just love that process. Okay, so we are just about out of time and people are really, really enjoying your talk. Tom, I'm with you, pencil and paper all over, forever, but I'm not an artist. So remember, you can buy signed books from Caitlin next week from Aesop's Fable. I'll put that link in the recap email I send out to everybody. But Caitlin, thank you so much for this and your book. I mean, it's just fantastic.
Thank you. And thanks for being such a good audience.
Well, obviously, we really enjoyed it. So for everybody who's here, thank you so much for being here with us and spending your Monday night with us. And I hope you all have a wonderful day. And we'll hopefully see you all soon at some other program. But Caitlin, I hope you have a wonderful day. And we look forward to seeing whatever comes up next for you.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.